The courthouse steps felt colder than they should have been that morning as she stood alone, clutching a folder of documents no lawyer would help her organize. Inside that building, her husband waited with 3 attorneys, a powerful family, and a smile that said he'd already won. He made sure she couldn't find representation, made sure every door closed before she could walk through it, so that when she arrived in that courtroom, she'd be defenseless and humiliated in front of everyone. What he didn't know was that being alone and being powerless aren't the same thing, because while he was busy building his perfect trap, someone else had been watching from the shadows, and today, when those courtroom doors opened, he was about to discover that underestimating the wrong woman doesn't just cost you a case, it costs you everything. Before we move forward, please like and subscribe for more stories. The photograph hung in the hallway of their home, framed in silver that cost more than most people's monthly rent. In it, she wore white lace and held lilies, smiling beside a man everyone said she was lucky to have married. Friends whispered she'd won some kind of lottery. Wealthy husband. Colonial-style house in the right neighborhood. A new last name that opened doors the old one never could. But even in that frozen moment of supposed happiness, there were details she'd trained herself not to see. His mother's embrace had been stiff, arms barely touching her back. His father had made a toast about expanding horizons that drew uncomfortable laughter. And throughout the reception, certain relatives kept using phrases like "quite a catch" and "moving up in the world," as though she were a transaction that had cleared successfully. She remembered thinking it was just wedding day nerves, that families took time to warm up, that love would smooth the rough edges. She'd been wrong about all of it. The small humiliations started so subtly she couldn't pinpoint when they began. At dinner parties with his colleagues, he'd laugh a little too hard when someone made comments about her background. When she'd mention her previous work in nonprofit management, he'd redirect the conversation as though she'd said something embarrassing. His mother developed a habit of correcting her pronunciation of certain words, always with a smile that suggested she was being helpful. Once at a holiday gathering, his college roommate asked about her family. Before she could answer, her husband jumped in with a joke about culture shock that made everyone chuckle. She'd waited for him to add something kind, something that honored where she came from. He never did. He just refilled his drink and moved on to talk about their upcoming ski trip. Over time, he began doing it himself, introducing her at events without mentioning she had a business degree, dismissing her opinions about investments as not really your area, talking over her in conversations, then apologizing later in private, saying he was just keeping things moving and she tended to overthink things in public. The worst part was how gradual it all felt, like temperature dropping 1 degree at a time until suddenly you realize you've been cold for months. He started making comments about her mother, how she was intense, how she talked too loud in restaurants, how she asked too many questions and made his family uncomfortable. He'd frame it with concern, suggesting that maybe some distance would help their marriage feel more stable, more unified. At first, she pushed back, but he was patient, persistent. He'd sigh heavily when her mother called, make plans on days she'd usually visit, mention how his parents never interfered the way hers did. Slowly, the calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. The space between them grew wider until weeks would pass without real conversation. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't articulate it. Her mother never said anything directly, just asked careful questions. Are you happy? Does he listen to you? Do you feel safe? Questions that felt too heavy to answer honestly. Then came the financial restructuring. He presented it as routine business strategy. His accountant recommended consolidating assets for tax purposes. Everything would be simpler, cleaner, more protected if it all ran through a single structure. The house, the investment accounts, even the consulting business she'd helped him build from the ground up during their first 2 years of marriage. She sat at the kitchen table while he walked her through documents she didn't fully understand. He was patient, explaining terms, reassuring her it was just paperwork. We're married, he said. What's mine is yours anyway. This just makes it official in the right way. She signed her name 17 times. It wasn't until months later, during an argument about something trivial, that she realized what she'd done. He'd said casually, almost kindly, that she needed to remember this was his house, his accounts, his business, that she was protected as his wife, but certain decisions weren't really hers to make. She'd stared at him, confused. He'd smiled and kissed her forehead, as though explaining something obvious to a child. The trap had been built so carefully, she never heard it lock. The breaking point came at his family summer gathering. It was one of those sprawling outdoor events his parents threw annually, with catered food and hired bartenders and the kind of casual wealth that pretended not to notice itself. She was standing near the dessert table when his uncle approached. He'd been drinking, though not enough to excuse what came next. He made a comment about her knowing her place, about how some people needed to remember where they came from, about how she should be grateful for the opportunities she'd been given. The words landed like stones in still water. She waited for her husband to step in, to defend her, to draw a line. He was 10 feet away, close enough to have heard, close enough to see her face. He laughed, not a shocked laugh or an uncomfortable one, just a regular laugh, like the joke had landed exactly as intended. That night, when they were alone, she told him what his uncle had said, how it made her feel, how she'd needed him to say something. He sighed like she was exhausting him. "You're being too sensitive." He didn't mean anything by it. "You're going to embarrass me if you make a scene over every little comment." She stopped trying to explain. Something in her went quiet. The marriage didn't explode. It calcified. Conversations became transactional. He started documenting everything, taking notes during arguments on his phone, recording discussions he claimed were for clarity. He'd provoke her calmly, pushing until her voice rose, then suddenly becoming reasonable again, as if her reaction was the real problem. She didn't understand at first. Not until much later, when she'd realized he wasn't trying to fix things. He was building a case. The threat came during a fight she couldn't even remember the origin of. They were standing in the kitchen, voices low and controlled the way they'd learned to keep things contained. He said it almost casually, like a weather prediction. "If this ever goes to court, you won't survive 5 minutes." He smiled when he said it. Not cruelly, almost kindly, like he was letting her in on a secret. That night, after he'd gone to bed, she sat in the dark of their living room and called her mother for the first time in 2 months. She didn't explain everything, couldn't find the words, just said things felt wrong, that she was scared but didn't know of what. Her mother listened without interrupting. The silence stretched long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then her mother asked a single question, her voice strange and careful. "Has he already filed?" She didn't understand what that meant. 3 days later, a process server arrived at her office. Divorce papers, and something else. A civil suit accusing her of financial misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and emotional instability that had damaged his business relationships. The language was formal and devastating. It painted her as reckless, unstable, a liability he'd been trying to manage for years. That same week, her access to their joint accounts was frozen. Her credit cards stopped working. The business email she'd used for 4 years was deactivated. She called an attorney her friend recommended, a decent lawyer with a calm voice who reviewed the paperwork and agreed to represent her. For 3 days, she felt like maybe she could survive this. Then the lawyer called, said there'd been a conflict of interest discovered, something about prior relationships with opposing counsel. He sounded genuinely apologetic, but the message was clear. He couldn't help her. She found another attorney, a woman this time, sharp and confident. They had 2 meetings, good meetings, strategic meetings. Then that lawyer withdrew too, citing unexpected scheduling conflicts. The third lawyer didn't even make it to a first meeting, just sent an email declining representation. She sat in her temporary apartment, the one she'd moved into after he'd changed the locks on their house, and realized this wasn't coincidence. Someone was buying the field. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived cold and gray. She stood on the courthouse steps in a simple navy dress, holding a folder with documents she'd organized herself. No attorney beside her, no family, just the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Reporters gathered near the entrance. She'd become a story. Wife faces powerful family alone. Divorce takes unexpected turn. Headlines that made her sound pitiful. His family's car pulled up. His parents emerged first, dressed like they were attending a gallery opening. Confident, unhurried. Then came the lawyers. 3 of them, carrying matching briefcases, moving like a machine built for exactly this kind of fight. Then he stepped out. Her husband, the man she'd loved once, in a version of herself that felt impossibly distant now. He was smiling, talking quietly to one of the attorneys. He glanced toward the courthouse steps and saw her standing there alone. His smile widened just slightly. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from her mother. Just 6 words. Sit, listen, and don't speak unless you're told. She read it twice, then walked through the courthouse doors. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined. Wood paneling and fluorescent lights, and that particular smell of old paper and floor polish. She took her seat at the defendant's table, the empty chair beside her feeling like its own form of testimony. He entered with his team. They spread out across their table like they were claiming territory. His parents took seats in the front row of the gallery. His mother wore pearls. His father checked his watch as though this were just another appointment in a busy day. She sat alone. The murmurs started immediately, whispers passing between observers like wind through grass. She felt every eye on her, measuring, judging, already writing the story of how this would end. The judge entered. Everyone stood. He was older, with silver hair and the kind of face that had stopped showing surprise decades ago. He settled into his chair and reviewed the files in front of him, then looked up. His eyes found her immediately, the empty chair beside her. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice even but pointed. "Do you have legal representation today?" She stood. "No, Your Honor." The words came out steadier than she felt. The lead attorney on her husband's side stood immediately. He was tall, expensive suit, the kind of voice trained to fill rooms. "Your Honor, if I may, the respondent has had ample time to secure counsel. We'd respectfully request the court proceed. This matter has already seen unnecessary delays due to the respondent's pattern of disorganization and irresponsibility." The judge frowned slightly. "Mr. Harrison, she's entitled to representation." "Of course, Your Honor. We simply note that multiple attorneys have declined this case, and we believe that speaks to the merits of her position, or lack thereof." Soft laughter rippled through his side of the courtroom. The judge looked at her again. "Ms. Collins, do you wish to request a continuance to obtain counsel?" Before she could answer, Harrison spoke again. "Your Honor, we'd argue strenuously against any further delays. The petitioner has been more than patient. Ms. Collins has demonstrated a pattern of avoidance and instability that these delays only reinforce." The words landed like accusations. Pattern, instability, irresponsibility. She felt her throat tighten. The judge allowed her husband to make an initial statement. He stood, buttoning his jacket, and addressed the court with the calm assurance of someone who'd never had to fight for a room's attention. "Your Honor, thank you for your time today. This has been an incredibly difficult process for me." He paused, letting the weight of emotion touch his voice just enough. "I've tried to approach this with patience, with understanding. But there comes a point when you realize someone isn't interested in resolution. They're interested in drama." He glanced at her, just briefly, just enough. She's always played the victim. Even now, sitting there without representation, I suspect it's calculated. She wants sympathy. She wants people to think I'm the villain. But the truth is in the documents. The financial records, the communications. Everything shows a pattern of reckless behavior I tried to manage for years. His voice was so reasonable, so measured. The courtroom absorbed every word like it was settling into fact. Then his legal team began presenting their case. They had everything organized. Text taken out of context that made her sound irrational. Edited recordings of arguments where her voice was raised and has stayed calm. Financial charts showing expenses they claimed she'd hidden. Emails where she'd expressed frustration, now framed as proof of emotional instability. One attorney used the word aggressive 4 times in 3 minutes. Another called her erratic. A third described her as unpredictable and emotionally volatile. The words weren't random. They were chosen, each one carrying weight beyond its definition. Each one, painting a picture the room was meant to see clearly. His mother sat in the gallery, shaking her head slowly. a performance of dignified disappointment. She tried to object once, stood and said, "That's not what happened." The judge looked at her. "Ms. Collins, you'll have your opportunity to respond. Please wait your turn." Harrison smiled slightly. She sat back down, feeling the room close around her. Then her husband did something she didn't expect. He stood again, not formally, almost casually, and turned slightly so his voice would carry to the gallery. "I mean, Your Honor, she doesn't even have a lawyer." He said it like he was genuinely confused. What exactly did she think was going to happen today? Some people laughed. Not everyone, but enough. A reporter in the back row-typed something quickly. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Collins addressed the court, not the gallery. But the damage was done. The humiliation was public now. Recorded. Real. She gripped the edge of the table to keep her hands from shaking. Her chest felt tight. Sounds began to blur together into a distant hum. She stared at the wood grain in front of her and tried to remember her mother's words. "Seat. Listen." The judge reviewed the submitted documents, his face unreadable. Then he looked at her again, something like concern crossing his features. "Ms. Collins, I'm going to suggest we postpone these proceedings to give you adequate time to obtain legal counsel. This is a complex matter, and you are at a significant disadvantage." Harrison stood immediately. "Your Honor, we'd object strongly to any continuance. Ms. Collins has had months to prepare. We believe this is a delay tactic, frankly, another example of the instability and avoidance we've documented. The petitioner has a right to resolution. He's been more than patient." The judge hesitated. She could see him weighing options, see the scale tilting away from her. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, just opening. A space where certainty used to be. Then the back doors of the courtroom opened. Not dramatically, not like in movies, just quietly. The soft sound of old hinges and footsteps on tile. A woman entered alone. She didn't rush, didn't look around at the faces turning toward her. She simply walked forward with the kind of certainty that didn't need announcement. She was dressed in a dark gray suit, simple and deliberate. Her hair was pulled back. She carried a single leather folder under one arm. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the court reporter looked up. The woman walked straight down the center aisle. She didn't stop at the gallery. She moved directly to the defendant's table, placed her folder down carefully, and took the empty seat beside her daughter. Only then did she speak. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "Your Honor, my name is Evelyn Harmon. I'm here on behalf of the respondent." The judge looked at her, really looked at her. He repeated her name slowly, as though testing its weight. Evelyn Harmon. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, or maybe something deeper. He glanced down at his files, then back up. "Ms. Harmon, I wasn't aware you were still practicing." "I'm not, Your Honor. Not publicly." She opened her folder with precise movements. "But I am licensed, and I'm invoking Provision 47C to enter representation under Familial Advisory Council in cases involving documented legal obstruction." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Harrison stood. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We'd object to any last-minute representation, particularly under such an obscure—" "It's not obscure, Mr. Harrison." The judge's voice was quiet but firm. "It's rarely used, but it's legitimate." He looked at Evelyn. "You'll need to submit the appropriate documentation." "Already prepared, Your Honor." She slid a sealed document across to the bailiff. The husband leaned forward, whispering urgently to his lead attorney. Harrison didn't respond right away. His face had changed. The confidence was still there, but something underneath had shifted. Evelyn didn't look at them. She addressed the court calmly. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to note a procedural error in the documents submitted by petitioner's counsel this morning. Section 14, paragraph 3 cites Statute 702.4 regarding financial disclosure timelines. That statute was amended in 2023. The version cited is outdated and non-binding." The judge looked down at the papers in front of him. His jaw tightened slightly. "Mr. Harrison?" Harrison shuffled through documents. "Your Honor, that's a minor clerical issue that doesn't affect the substance. It affects admissibility." Evelyn's voice remained perfectly even, and it suggests the due diligence standards here may need review. The courtroom had gone completely silent. The husband stared at the woman beside his wife. His face was tight, confused. This wasn't in his plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. Evelyn pulled another document from her folder. Your Honor, I'd like to request a temporary pause in proceedings while the court reviews a sealed motion I'm prepared to file. It concerns scope expansion and jurisdictional questions that may affect how this case should properly proceed. The judge took the document. Read the header. His expression changed. Hardened. He looked at Evelyn for a long moment, then at the petitioner's table, then back at the papers. The court will take a brief recess. His voice had changed entirely. No longer casual. No longer routine. He stood. Everyone stood. He disappeared into his chambers without another word. In the sudden stillness, the husband turned in his seat, stared at his wife. His face was no longer confident. For the first time since this began, he looked uncertain. She met his eyes. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Her mother's hand rested calmly on the table between them. The courtroom doors closed, and somewhere in that silence, the balance had shifted. The silence that followed the judge's exit was thick and strange. The courtroom had transformed from a place of routine proceedings into something else entirely. People shifted in their seats. Whispered conversations started and stopped. Even the court reporter seemed uncertain whether to pack up or wait. At the defendant's table, the wife sat perfectly still. Her mother beside her showed no emotion, no triumph, no concern. She simply organized papers in her folder with the same deliberate care she'd shown since entering. Across the aisle, the husband leaned into a tight huddle with his legal team. His voice was low but urgent. His parents remained in their seats. His mother's expression fixed in what might have been confusion or might have been the first touch of concern. In the hallway outside, things moved faster. The husband's father made phone calls. Harrison spoke to junior associates who scattered to pull files. Someone asked court staff about Evelyn Harmon, who she was, why the judge had reacted that way. The answers came back fragmented but consistent. She'd been someone once, a long time ago, a federal case, something about corporate exploitation. Then she disappeared from public practice. No one could say exactly why the judge had recognized her name so immediately, only that he had. 15 minutes passed before the bailiff returned and announced court would resume in 5 minutes. The energy had changed completely. What had felt like a certain outcome now felt unstable, unpredictable. When the judge returned, his demeanor was entirely different. He sat down with careful formality and addressed the room in a voice that carried weight. This court has reviewed the sealed motion submitted by Ms. Harmon. I'm ordering an expansion of the record to include materials relevant to the claims raised. Mr. Harrison, your team will have 48 hours to respond to the amended scope. Harrison stood quickly. Your Honor, we weren't provided notice of any expanded scope. We'd request clarification on what claims are being added and on what basis. The basis is documented legal obstruction, Mr. Harrison. The judge's voice was flat. Ms. Harmon has provided preliminary evidence suggesting the respondent's inability to secure counsel was not coincidental but coordinated. If that's accurate, it changes the nature of these proceedings significantly. The wife felt her breath catch. She'd suspected something was wrong with how every lawyer had withdrawn, but hearing it stated as fact, as something provable, made it real in a way that felt both validating and terrifying. Evelyn stood. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to formally enter representation for Ms. Collins under the provisions outlined in my motion. I'll be filing expanded claims within the week that go beyond the divorce proceedings currently before the court. Expanded how? The judge's question was direct. Corporate governance violations, financial coercion within a marital context, and systematic obstruction of legal access. She paused just long enough for the weight to settle. This case is not simply a divorce, Your Honor. It's a pattern. Harrison's face had gone tight. Your Honor, this is absurd. Counsel is attempting to turn a straightforward divorce proceeding into some kind of conspiracy theory. The respondent's inability to secure counsel is likely related to the weakness of her position, not some grand scheme. Then you should have no difficulty responding to the amended filings. The judge's tone left no room for argument. The court is ordering a stay on the divorce proceedings pending investigation into the obstruction claims. Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the court's investigative arm for review of the financial documentation submitted by both parties. The word both hung in the air like a sword. The husband stood suddenly, not through his lawyer, just stood, his voice sharp. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We've done nothing wrong. This woman shows up with some vague accusations, and suddenly we're being investigated. The judge looked at him coldly. Mr. Collins, you will address the court through your attorney. Sit down. He sat, but the mask had cracked. For the first time, real fear showed on his face. Evelyn continued, as though the interruption hadn't happened. Your Honor, I'm also submitting a list of entities and individuals we believe are relevant to this matter. They include several shell companies, a charitable foundation, and multiple law firms that received retainers from petitioner's family within days of Ms. Collins attempting to secure representation. She slid a document to the bailiff. The judge reviewed it. His expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested he was seeing connections form. I'll review this in chambers, he said. Mr. Harrison, I expect your response within the timeline provided. This case is adjourned pending further filings. The gavel came down. The husband turned immediately to his wife as people began standing. His voice was low, tight with anger and confusion. What did you do? For the first time in months, she answered him directly. Her voice was quiet but steady. I called my mother. His face went blank. Then he turned and looked at Evelyn properly for the first time. Really looked at her, trying to understand who this woman was and how she dismantled his entire strategy in less than an hour. Evelyn gathered her folder, placed a hand briefly on her daughter's shoulder, and walked toward the exit. She didn't look at the husband, didn't acknowledge his parents, simply left the courtroom with the same calm certainty she'd entered with. The wife followed. Behind her, she heard Harrison's voice, urgent and frustrated, trying to regroup his team. Outside the courthouse, reporters had multiplied. Cameras tracked their exit. Questions were shouted. Ms. Collins, who is your attorney? What are the new charges? Is this related to the family's business dealings? Evelyn didn't stop, didn't answer. She walked to a car parked a block away, her daughter beside her. Only when they were inside, doors closed, did either of them speak. Mom, the wife's voice was shaking. What just happened? Evelyn started the car. We changed the field. But what did you file? What evidence do you have? Enough to make them nervous. Not enough to finish this yet. She pulled into traffic smoothly. But they don't know that. And right now, that matters more. They drove in silence for several minutes. The wife watched the city pass by outside the window, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. The judge's reaction, the case expansion, her husband's face when he realized he was losing control. Finally, she asked the question she'd been holding since her mother walked into that courtroom. Who are you? Really? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She navigated through traffic, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured. Someone who used to do this kind of work a long time ago. Before I had to stop. Why did you have to stop? Because people like his family made it dangerous to continue. The weight of that statement settled between them. Evelyn pulled into a diner parking lot far from downtown, one of those places that looked unchanged since the 70s. They sat in a corner booth, coffee growing cold between them, and Evelyn pulled out her phone. She opened an article. Old. Archived. From nearly 30 years ago. The headline read, Federal Case Exposes Corporate Exploitation Ring. The subheading mentioned a young attorney who'd built the case, who'd won against impossible odds, who'd helped dismantle a network that had been operating for decades. The wife read the name attached to the story. Read it twice. Evelyn Harmon. She looked up at her mother. This is you. That was me. What happened after? Evelyn took her phone back, closed the article. I won the case, and then I was buried for it. Not directly. Nothing you could prove. But suddenly every firm I approached had scheduling conflicts. Clients I'd worked with for years stopped returning calls. Judges who'd respected me started recusing themselves from my cases. She paused, her eyes distant. I was frozen out, professionally destroyed in ways that looked like coincidence. By the time I understood what was happening, I had a young daughter to protect and no career left to fight for. The wife felt something twist in her chest. Me? You? Evelyn's voice softened slightly. So I disappeared. Not completely. I did advisory work, quiet consulting for nonprofits and regulatory groups. Nothing visible, nothing that would draw attention. I helped people win cases without ever appearing in courtrooms. For 25 years, that's what I did. Why didn't you tell me? Because knowing made you vulnerable. And because I convinced myself staying hidden was the same as staying safe. She met her daughter's eyes. I was wrong about that. The wife's hands were shaking. When did you know? About him. About what he was doing. Early. The admission was quiet but firm. I saw the signs during your engagement. The way his family looked at you. The comments disguised as jokes. The subtle corrections. But you were so happy. And I thought maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Maybe I'd been away from this too long and was paranoid. But you weren't. No, I wasn't. Evelyn's jaw tightened. When you called me 2 months ago, barely able to explain why you felt trapped, I knew. And when the divorce papers were filed with that civil suit attached, I knew exactly what they were doing. Building a narrative, trapping you financially and legally so you couldn't fight back. The lawyers who dropped me weren't dropping you because your case was weak. They were being blocked. Quietly. Efficiently. His family has been doing this for generations. They know how to control a field without leaving obvious fingerprints. She paused. So I let them think it was working. The wife stared at her. You let them? Every lawyer who withdrew, every door that closed, every humiliation you endured, it built a pattern I could document. They thought they were isolating you. They were actually creating evidence. Evelyn's voice remained steady, but there was something underneath it. Something that might have been regret. I should have stepped in sooner. I know that. I convinced myself that letting them reveal themselves completely was strategic. But it cost you, and I'm sorry for that. Tears burned behind the wife's eyes. Not from anger, from something more complicated. You came. Of course I came. That judge. He knew you. He was a junior clerk on the federal case. 30 years ago. He remembered. Evelyn's expression was unreadable. People remember when someone burns down a system, even if they eventually buried that person for doing it. The wife absorbed this slowly. Her mother wasn't just a lawyer. She was someone who'd fought these fights before, someone who'd paid a price for winning, someone who'd disappeared into the background but never actually stopped working. What happens now? Now we build the real case. Evelyn pulled out her folder, began spreading documents across the table. The obstruction of your legal access is just the foundation. What matters is what they were trying to hide. The business structures, the shell companies, the money that moved through accounts under your name without your knowledge. I signed things, documents. He told me it was just tax strategy. I know. I found them. Every signature you made, every transfer that ran through your name, it creates liability exposure. That's what they were building. A narrative where you're complicit in financial misconduct. So when the marriage ends, you're not just left with nothing. You're left facing potential charges. The words hit like cold water. They were going to have me arrested? Not arrested. Just compromised enough that you'd accept any settlement to avoid investigation. It's cleaner than destruction. It's containment. The wife felt sick. How do we stop it? We already started. The motion I filed doesn't just claim they blocked your legal access. It argues that obstruction was part of a larger pattern of coercive control tied to business operations. That changes jurisdiction. That brings in regulatory oversight. That makes this bigger than a divorce. Is that true? Do we have proof of all that? Evelyn's expression was careful. We have enough to make them believe we might. And right now, belief is more useful than proof. Over the next 2 days, the story shifted. What had been gossip about a messy divorce became something else. Media outlets started asking questions about the expanded court scope. Financial reporters noticed the list of entities Evelyn had submitted. One investigative journalist made connections between the husband's family charitable foundation and several companies that had been flagged for questionable practices years ago. The narrative was changing from wife without a lawyer to what exactly is being investigated here. The husband's company received calls from nervous investors. His parents hired crisis management consultants. And somewhere in all of that machinery, trying to control the story, someone made a mistake. A junior accountant from one of the shell companies reached out through an anonymous tip line. He had spreadsheets, transfer records, and one audio recording he'd made during a meeting where he'd been told to restructure accounts in ways that felt illegal but were framed as routine. He sent it all to Evelyn. The recording wasn't dramatic. It was bureaucratic. The husband and his father discussing account transfers, talking about keeping certain activities siloed, mentioning the wife by name as someone who wouldn't understand the complexity anyway. Then the father said something that made everything clear. As long as she stays boxed in until this is finalized, the exposure is manageable. But if she somehow gets actual counsel, things get complicated. The husband's voice responded, casual and confident. She won't. We made sure of that. Evelyn played the recording for her daughter in the small apartment she'd moved into after leaving the house. They sat on a couch that didn't match anything, in a space that was temporary but felt safer than anywhere she'd lived in years. When it ended, the wife was crying. Not from sadness, from rage. They knew, she said. They knew exactly what they were doing. Yes. Evelyn's voice was quiet. And now we have it documented. What do we do with it? We file it. With the court. With the regulatory investigators. And we prepare you for what comes next. The wife looked at her mother. What comes next? They're going to fight. Not with law. With pressure. They'll try to discredit me. They'll come after you. They'll make this uglier before it gets better. She paused. I need you to understand that. And I need you to decide if you're ready. The wife thought about the wedding photo that used to hang in a house that was never really hers. Thought about the woman in white who believed love would smooth the rough edges. Thought about every moment she'd made herself smaller, quieter, more acceptable. I'm ready. Evelyn nodded once. Then we go to work. The next morning, new filings hit the court. Not just amended complaints. A full restructuring of the case with documented evidence of systematic legal obstruction, financial coercion, and marital manipulation tied to business fraud. The divorce was now officially a footnote to something much larger. 3 shell companies connected to the family were named specifically, a charitable foundation that had been used to move questionable funds. Multiple law firms that had received suspicious retainers within days of the wife seeking representation. And attached to it all, the recording. The husband's legal team scrambled. Harrison filed emergency motions claiming the evidence was obtained improperly, that it was taken out of context, that this was character assassination disguised as legal strategy. But the court's investigative arm had already begun working. Financial regulators had flagged the entities for review, and the judge had made it clear this was no longer a simple domestic matter. 2 days later, protective orders were issued. The wife was assigned security consultation after a concerning incident where someone had followed her from store. The husband's access to certain accounts was temporarily frozen pending investigation. His confidence was cracking visibly now. He showed up to a deposition looking exhausted, snapped at questions, made mistakes. During one exchange, he made a comment about the investigator's competence that had racial undertones clear enough that his own attorney had to interject. The court reporter noted every word. His mother tried a different approach. She appeared in a courthouse hallway one afternoon when the wife was leaving a meeting with investigators. Approached carefully, voice soft and concerned. I know this seems complicated, she said, but families work these things out. We don't need courts and investigators and all this ugliness. We can find a resolution that works for everyone. The wife looked at her. This woman who'd spent years correcting how she spoke, who'd made subtle comments about where she came from, who'd watched her son humiliate his wife and never once intervened. A resolution, the wife repeated. Yes, we're prepared to offer a very generous settlement. Enough to start fresh. Somewhere else. Away from all this attention. The subtext was clear. Take the money. Disappear. Stop making this difficult. The wife's voice was steady when she answered. I don't want your money. I want the truth documented. I want the pattern exposed. And I want everyone to understand what you did. The mother's face hardened. You should think very carefully about what you're doing. You're making enemies of people who have reach. Influence. You'll regret this. Maybe, but at least I'll regret something I chose. She walked away, didn't look back, and for the first time in years, her steps felt like her own. That night, her mother told her something she'd been holding back. They're not just fighting to win anymore. They're fighting to survive, and that makes them more dangerous. Should I be scared? You should be careful, but not powerless. There's a difference. The wife understood. Being scared meant staying frozen. Being careful meant staying strategic. The case was transforming. What had started as her sitting alone in a courtroom with no lawyer had become something larger. The financial investigation expanded. More employees from the husband's companies began cooperating quietly. Documents surfaced showing patterns of misconduct that stretched back years. And at the center of it all, the wife was no longer just a defendant or a victim. She was becoming a witness. 1 week after the expanded filings, the judge called another hearing. The courtroom was packed, not with gossip seekers, with regulatory observers, financial investigators, federal monitors. This wasn't a divorce court anymore. It was something else entirely. Evelyn sat beside her daughter at the defendant's table. Across the aisle, Harrison and his team looked tight and worried. The husband sat between them, his face unreadable, but his hands clenched on the table. The judge entered. Everyone stood. When he sat, his expression was grave. This court has reviewed the expanded evidence submitted by respondents' counsel. I've also received preliminary reports from the investigative teams. What's become clear is that the initial scope of this proceeding was insufficient to address the actual issues at hand. He paused. Let that settle. I'm hereby ordering a full forensic audit of the entities named in Ms. Harmon's filings. I'm also referring several matters to federal regulatory authorities for criminal review. The divorce proceedings will remain stayed until these investigations are complete. Harrison stood. Your Honor, we strenuously object. This has become a fishing expedition that goes far beyond. Mr. Harrison, the judge's voice was sharp. Your client and his family made a strategic decision to weaponize the court system against someone they assumed couldn't fight back. In doing so, they exposed patterns of conduct that this court cannot ignore. The objection is noted and overruled. The husband's father stood in the gallery. Your Honor, this is outrageous. We have rights. You'll sit down, sir, or I'll have you removed. The judge didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The father sat. The judge continued. Additionally, I'm issuing protective orders for Ms. Collins and appointing a special master to review all financial documentation related to marital assets. No transfers. No liquidations. No restructuring without court approval. Every sentence was a wall closing in. The husband finally spoke, not through his lawyer. His voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. Your Honor, this is absurd. My wife is the one who. Your wife, the judge interrupted, has presented documented evidence of systematic obstruction and coercion. You've presented edited recordings and selective narratives. If you have contradicting evidence, present it through proper channels. But you will not interrupt these proceedings again. The silence was absolute. Evelyn stood. Your Honor, we'll have additional filings within the week. We appreciate the court's diligence in this matter. The court is adjourned. The gavel came down. As people filed out, the wife stayed seated for a moment. She watched her husband's team gathering papers with tense efficiency. Watched his parents leaving quickly, faces closed. Watched the reporters hovering outside, already typing updates. She thought about the woman who'd walked into this building weeks ago. Alone, humiliated, everyone certain of how her story would end. That woman didn't exist anymore. Evelyn touched her shoulder gently. We should go. They left the courtroom together. Outside, cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. But the wife kept walking, her mother beside her. And for the first time since this began, she felt something shift inside her. Not victory, not yet, but possibility. The field had changed, and she was no longer fighting from the ground. She was standing. The story changed overnight. By morning, the headlines had shifted completely. No longer was it about a wife who showed up to court without a lawyer. Now it was about expanded investigations, mysterious legal interventions, and questions about a prominent family's business practices. The husband's firm received calls from concerned investors. Board members requested emergency meetings. Partners who'd been friendly suddenly had scheduling conflicts. The machinery of reputation management kicked into high gear, but the damage was already spreading. In a quiet diner 20 miles outside the city, the wife sat across from her mother and finally asked the question she'd been holding since the courtroom. Who are you really? Not just the case you won. All of it. Evelyn sipped her coffee slowly. Outside the window, morning traffic crawled past. Normal people living normal lives, unaware of the systems that operated invisibly around them. I was 28 when I took that federal case, she began. Young, ambitious. I believed the law was supposed to protect people, not just power. The case involved a network of companies using financial structures to exploit workers, manipulate contracts, and hide assets from regulatory oversight. It was corporate crime dressed up as business strategy. She paused, her eyes distant. It took 4 years to build. Every time I got close to something, doors would close. Witnesses would suddenly refuse to testify. Documents would disappear. But I kept going. And eventually, I found someone inside who was willing to talk. The wife listened, seeing her mother differently now. Not as the woman who'd raised her, but as someone who'd fought battles she'd never fully understood. When we won, it felt like proof that the system could work. That justice wasn't just for people who could afford it. Evelyn's voice grew quieter. I was wrong about that. Or at least, I was naive about the cost. What happened? The families involved in that case had reach. Influence. Within 6 months, I couldn't get hired anywhere legitimate. Judges would recuse themselves when I filed briefs. Bar associations launched frivolous ethics investigations. Nothing stuck, but it didn't need to. The message was clear. I'd embarrassed the wrong people, and there would be consequences. She looked at her daughter directly. I had you by then. You were 3 years old, and I had to make a choice. Keep fighting publicly and risk both our safety or disappear in a work that mattered but didn't draw attention. So you vanished. Professionally, yes. I did advisory work, helped nonprofits navigate regulatory systems, consulted on policy reforms through third parties. I worked on changing structures without putting my name on anything. For 25 years, that's what I did. The wife felt something tight in her chest. You gave up your career for me. I gave up visibility, not purpose. Evelyn's voice was firm, but I convinced myself that staying hidden kept you safe, that if I didn't draw attention, you'd be protected from the kind of retaliation I'd faced. That's why you didn't stop my marriage. I saw the signs, the way his family looked at you, the subtle corrections, the jokes that weren't jokes. She paused. But you loved him, and I thought maybe I was seeing patterns where there weren't any. That maybe I'd been away from this too long and was paranoid. The admission hung between them. When did you know for sure? When you called me 2 months ago, barely able to explain why you felt trapped. The words you used, the way you apologized for bothering me. I knew exactly what was happening because I'd seen it before. Evelyn's jaw tightened. And when those divorce papers came with the civil suit attached, I knew they were following a playbook. Isolate the target. Control the narrative. Make sure they can't fight back effectively. The lawyers who dropped me, every single one was blocked. Not obviously. Nothing you could prove easily. But his family has been doing this for generations. They understand how to control access to justice without leaving clear evidence. She met her daughter's eyes. So I let them think it was working. The wife stared at her. You let them. Every obstruction they created, every door they closed, it built documentation. They thought they were trapping you. They were actually creating the pattern we needed to prove systematic interference. Evelyn's expression was complicated. I should have stepped in sooner. I know that. I told myself it was strategic to let them reveal themselves completely. But it cost you. And I'm sorry. The wife's voice was thick. You came when it mattered. I should have come sooner. They sat in silence for a moment. Then the wife asked quietly, "Why did you stay away from my marriage?" Really? Evelyn looked out the window. Because power structures like his family don't fall from confrontation. They fall from documentation. From letting them believe they're winning while you build the case that proves they're not. She turned back. I watched. I waited. And when when they finally showed their full strategy, I knew it was time. You let me suffer so you could build a case. I let you endure what I hoped you could survive so that when we fought back, it would be permanent. Evelyn's voice cracked slightly. I was wrong to wait that long, but I wasn't wrong about needing the full pattern. The wife absorbed this slowly. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She'd been preparing, watching, building something larger than immediate rescue. It didn't erase the pain, but it explained the silence. What happens now? Now they panic, and when they panic, they make mistakes. Evelyn was right. Within days, the family's response became visible. Not in courts, in other channels. Anonymous blog posts appeared questioning Evelyn's history, claiming she'd been disbarred in the past, which was false, suggesting she'd manipulated her daughter into this situation. Old photos appeared online, edited to suggest things that hadn't happened. The wife's social media, which she rarely used, filled with messages. Some supportive, many hateful. Accounts with no followers calling her a gold digger, a liar, someone playing victim for attention. She stopped checking her phone. Then came the more direct approach. The husband sent a message through a mutual acquaintance, someone they'd both known from before everything fell apart. The message was simple. I never meant to hurt you. Let's end this before it destroys both of us. The wife showed it to her mother. Evelyn read it once. He's trying to sound reasonable now, making it seem like you're the one escalating. Don't respond. She didn't. 2 days later, something else happened. The wife was leaving a grocery store near her apartment. It was evening, not late, but dark enough that the parking lot felt isolated. She noticed a man walking behind her. Not running, not threatening, just walking at the same pace, staying close. When she reached her car, he was still there, close enough that she could hear his footsteps. She turned. He was middle-aged, nondescript, dressed in plain clothes. He didn't smile, didn't try to look friendly. He just said quietly, "You should tell your mother to stop." Then he walked away. She got in her car with shaking hands and called Evelyn immediately. Her mother listened without interrupting. When the wife finished, there was a long silence. "Pack a bag," Evelyn said finally. "You're staying with me until we arrange protective services." "They're threatening me." "Yes. This is really happening." "Yes." The wife felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just legal maneuvering anymore. This was real danger. Protective services were assigned the next day. Not dramatic, just a contact protocol and awareness. But the message was clear. The family was willing to escalate beyond courtrooms. That night, in her mother's apartment, the wife asked the question she'd been afraid to voice. "Are we going to win this?" Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know, but I know we're not going to stop." They sat together in the quiet. Two women against a structure that had been operating for generations. It felt impossible, but somehow it also felt necessary. The next morning brought a different kind of revelation. Evelyn admitted something she'd been holding back. "I made a mistake once. A long time ago. I believed that if I just endured long enough, if I let powerful people reveal themselves naturally, the system would eventually correct itself. Did it? No. I had to walk away. And for 25 years, I convinced myself that was wisdom, that patience and documentation were the same as justice." She looked at her daughter. "I was wrong. Endurance isn't protection, and I should have come for you sooner." The admission was quiet but complete. The wife reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "You're here now." Something in Evelyn's expression softened. "Yes, I'm here now." Over the following days, the wife did something she hadn't expected. She stopped being just a client, just someone her mother was protecting. She became active. She went through old messages on her phone, conversations with her husband that at the time seemed normal but now read differently, requests for her signature that she'd thought were routine, comments about finances that suddenly felt like maneuvering. She found financial files she'd copied years ago and forgotten about, account statements, transfer records, documents she'd signed without fully understanding. She brought them all to her mother. Evelyn reviewed everything carefully. This is good. This shows pattern. This shows you were systematically excluded from real information while being made legally responsible. I didn't realize what I was signing. That's the point. They built plausible deniability. But the volume of it, the consistency, it tells a story. The wife was no longer just someone things were happening to. She was building the case herself. Then came the deposition. The husband was required to give testimony under oath. The wife wasn't present, but her mother was. And that night, Evelyn came home looking grim. What happened? He fell apart. Evelyn set her briefcase down heavily. Started confident. But when we pressed on specific timelines, specific decisions, he got angry. Defensive. Made statements that contradicted earlier filings. Is that good? It's useful. But it also showed us something else. She paused. He made a comment about opposing counsel. About their competence. The phrasing he used had clear racial implications. The wife felt her stomach drop. On the record, the court reporter typed every word. They sat with that for a moment. The racism that had been subtle and deniable in their marriage was now documented in official testimony. They're losing control, Evelyn said quietly. And when they lose control, they reveal themselves. But the family had one more strategy. His mother appeared again. Not in a courthouse this time. In the lobby of the building where the wife was meeting with investigators. She approached carefully, her voice soft. Almost kind. I know this all seems very complicated. But families should be able to work things out privately. All this legal fighting, all these investigators, it doesn't help anyone. The wife waited. We're prepared to offer you a very generous settlement. Enough to start fresh. Move somewhere new. Away from all this attention and stress. She paused meaningfully. Away from people who might be using you for their own purposes. The implication was clear. Her mother was the problem. Her mother was manipulating her. The wife looked at this woman who'd spent years correcting how she spoke. Who'd made comments about where she came from. Who'd watched her son systematically isolate and humiliate his wife and never once intervened. You want me to take money and disappear. I want you to have peace. To move forward with your life. By pretending none of this happened. By being realistic about what you can actually win here. The older woman's voice hardened slightly. You're making enemies of people with reach. With influence. With resources you can't imagine. This will not end well for you if you continue. The wife felt something crystallize inside her. I don't want your money. I don't want your version of peace. I want the truth documented. I want the pattern exposed. I want everyone to see exactly what your family does to people. The woman's face went cold. You're making a serious mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. She walked away. Didn't look back. Felt her heart pounding, but her steps steady. That night, her mother said something she'd been holding back. They're not fighting to win anymore. They're fighting to survive. That makes them more dangerous. Should I be scared? You should be careful, but not powerless. There's a difference. Evelyn's eyes were serious. Being scared means staying frozen. Being careful means staying strategic. Can you do that? The wife thought about the woman who'd walked into that first courtroom alone, who believed she had no options, who'd let herself be made smaller and quieter for years. Yes, I can do that. The case continued expanding. More employees from the husband's companies began cooperating with investigators. Quietly, carefully, each one adding pieces to a larger pattern. Financial records surfaced showing questionable transactions going back years. Money moved through accounts in ways that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. The charitable foundation his family ran showed patterns of spending that didn't match its stated mission. The investigators worked methodically. Every document led to another question. Every answer revealed new connections. And at the center of it all, the wife was transforming. Not into her mother, not into some version of herself that played by their rules, into someone who understood that justice wasn't given. It was built, piece by piece, document by document, truth by truth. 3 weeks after the case expansion, another hearing was called. The courtroom was different now, not packed with gossip seekers, but with regulatory observers, financial monitors, people whose presence meant this had become something official, something serious. The judge entered and the room went silent immediately. When he spoke, his voice carried weight. This court has reviewed preliminary findings from the investigative teams. What's emerged is a pattern of conduct that goes beyond marital dispute into questions of corporate governance, financial manipulation, and systematic legal obstruction. He paused, letting that settle. I'm ordering asset freezes on 3 entities connected to the petitioner's family pending completion of the financial audit. I'm also referring several matters to federal regulatory authorities for potential criminal review. The husband's legal team shifted uncomfortably. Harrison stood. Your Honor, these actions are premature. We haven't had adequate opportunity to respond to many of these allegations. You've had ample opportunity, Mr. Harrison. Your client chose to use that time filing procedural objections rather than substantive responses. The judge's tone was sharp. The objection is overruled. In the gallery, the husband's father stood suddenly. Your Honor, this is an outrage. We have rights. We have. You'll sit down immediately, sir, or I will have you removed from his courtroom and potentially charged with contempt. The judge didn't raise his voice. The threat was in the steadiness of it. The father sat. The judge continued. The divorce proceedings will remain stayed until the primary investigations are complete. No assets will be transferred, no accounts restructured, no business entities dissolved without explicit court approval and regulatory oversight. Every sentence was another wall closing in. The husband finally broke. He stood, not through his attorney, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Your Honor, this is completely absurd. My wife is the one who should be. Mr. Collins, the judge's voice cut through like steel. Your wife has presented documented, corroborated evidence of systematic obstruction and financial coercion. You've presented edited materials and selective narratives. If you have legitimate contradicting evidence, present it through proper channels. But you will not interrupt these proceedings again, or I will have you removed as well. The silence was absolute. The husband's face had gone white. For the first time, genuine fear showed clearly. Not anger, not frustration. Fear. The judge looked at Evelyn. Ms. Harmon, does the respondent have additional filings? Yes, Your Honor. We'll submit updated documentation within 48 hours, including testimony from additional witnesses and financial analysis from the court-appointed forensic accountant. The court looks forward to reviewing those materials. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. As people filed out, the wife remained seated for a moment. She watched the husband's team gathering papers with tight, controlled movements. Watched his parents leaving quickly, faces closed and angry. Watched reporters hovering outside, already typing updates. She thought about the woman who'd sat in this room weeks ago. Alone. Humiliated. Everyone certain of how her story would end. That woman felt like a different person entirely. Evelyn touched her shoulder. Ready. They walked out together. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. But the wife kept her head up, her steps steady, and for the first time since this began, she felt something shift fundamentally inside her. Not victory. Not yet. But power. The kind that didn't come from money or family name or who you knew. The kind that came from standing up when standing felt impossible. The kind that came from refusing to disappear. Outside, the evening air was cold and clean. Her mother walked beside her, and somewhere in the distance, the city moved on with its normal rhythm. But for them, nothing was normal anymore. And somehow, that felt exactly right. They'd changed the field. They'd exposed the pattern. And they weren't finished yet. The wife looked at her mother. What's next? Evelyn's expression was calm, but determined. Now we finish what we started. Together, they walked toward the parking garage. Two women who'd been silent for different reasons, for different years, now speaking the same language. The language of consequence. And the family that had tried to silence them was finally beginning to understand what that meant. The courtroom reconvened on a gray morning 3 weeks later. The atmosphere was completely different from that first hearing where the wife had sat alone and humiliated. Now the room was filled with federal observers, financial regulators, and civil rights monitors. This wasn't gossip anymore. This was consequence taking shape. The wife sat beside her mother at the defendant's table, papers organized in neat folders in front of them. Across the aisle, The husband's legal team looked diminished somehow. Still professional, still expensive, but the confidence had drained away. The husband himself sat rigid, his face carefully controlled, but his hands gripping the table edge. His parents were absent from the gallery. A calculated choice, probably advised by their own attorneys. The judge entered and everyone stood. When he sat, the weight of the proceedings settled over the room like something physical. We're here today to review testimony and evidence related to the expanded investigations into financial misconduct, corporate governance violations, and systematic legal obstruction. Mr. Harrison, is your client prepared to proceed? Harrison stood. Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Harmon. Evelyn rose smoothly. The respondent is ready, Your Honor. The first witness was the accountant who'd contacted them anonymously. He looked nervous but determined as he took the stand. Under oath, he explained his role at one of the shell companies, how money was moved between accounts, how transactions were structured to obscure their real purpose. Can you describe what you were told about these transfers? Evelyn asked calmly. The accountant glanced at the husband briefly, then away. I was told they were routine business restructuring, but the instructions didn't match standard practices. Money would come in through one entity, get split across multiple accounts, then consolidated under different names. Were you ever told why this was necessary? I was told it was for tax optimization and liability protection, but when I asked specific questions, I was told not to worry about the details. That was above my level. Did you ever see the name of my client, Ms. Collins, on any of these accounts? Yes, several times. Her name was on signature authority documents for accounts I'm certain she never accessed. How can you be certain? Because the access logs showed activity from IP addresses and devices that didn't match her information. Someone was using her credentials without her knowledge. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's keys. Evelyn submitted documents showing the access patterns. The discrepancies were clear. The husband shifted in his seat. Then came the audio recording. The one the accountant had made during a meeting where he'd been instructed to restructure accounts in ways that felt illegal but were framed as routine. The recording played through speakers in the courtroom. The husband's voice was clearly audible, casual, confident, discussing how to keep certain transactions isolated. His father's voice joined in, mentioning the wife by name. As long as she stays boxed in until this is finalized, the exposure is manageable. The husband's response was calm. She won't be a problem. We made sure of that. The silence after the recording ended was profound. The judge looked at the husband. Mr. Collins, do you dispute the authenticity of that recording? The husband's attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, we'd question the circumstances under which this recording was obtained and whether. I asked your client a direct question, Mr. Harrison. The husband stood slowly. His voice was tight. That conversation was taken out of context. The context seems fairly clear, Mr. Collins. Sit down. He sat. Evelyn called her next witness, a former employee from a charitable foundation. She testified about funds being redirected from stated charitable purposes to what appeared to be personal expenses, travel, property, payments to individuals with no clear connection to the foundation's mission. Were you ever asked to alter documentation related to these expenses? Yes, multiple times. I was told it was necessary for privacy reasons. That donors prefer discretion. Did you believe that? The woman hesitated. At first, yes, but after a while, the pattern became obvious. This wasn't about donor privacy. It was about hiding money. Harrison cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint her as a disgruntled former employee with an agenda. But her testimony remained consistent, calm, detailed. Then Evelyn did something the husband wasn't prepared for. She called him to the stand. His attorney objected immediately. Your Honor, the petitioner is not required to testify at this stage. He's not required to, the judge agreed. But Ms. Harmon has the right to call him. Mr. Collins approached the stand. The husband walked slowly to the witness box, took the oath, sat down with careful composure. Evelyn stood at a distance, her voice calm and measured. Mr. Collins, when did you first become aware that your wife was attempting to secure legal representation? I don't recall the specific date. Was it before or after you filed for divorce? Before. And did you take any actions to influence her ability to obtain counsel? No. Evelyn pulled out a document. This is a retainer agreement between your family's legal fund and the firm of Whitmore and Associates. It's dated 3 days after Ms. Collins first contacted an attorney. Can you explain why your family would retain a firm that had no prior relationship with you? The husband's jaw tightened. I'm not familiar with every legal arrangement my family makes, but you're listed as a signatory on this retainer. Silence. Evelyn moved to another document. Here's another. Brennan Legal Group. Retained 2 days after Ms. Collins attempted to hire them. Again, you're listed as having approved the retainer. Those were conflict checks. Standard practice. Conflict checks don't typically involve $50,000 retainers, Mr. Collins. His attorney objected. The judge overruled. Evelyn continued methodically, leading him through timelines, through decisions, through contradictions between what he'd claimed in earlier filings and what the evidence showed. With each question, his composure cracked a little more. Finally, she asked the question that shifted everything. Mr. Collins, did you ever believe your wife had the right to win this case? He stared at her. That's not a fair question. It's a simple question. Did you believe she had the right to equal legal representation? To a fair hearing? To actual justice? His voice rose. I believed I had the right to protect what I built. What my family built. She came from nothing. She contributed nothing. And she wanted to take half of everything because of a piece of paper we signed. The words hung in the air. Evelyn's voice remained perfectly even. Thank you. No further questions. The husband sat there for a moment, seemingly unaware of what he'd just said. Then his attorney was standing, calling for a recess, trying to contain the damage. But it was too late. The mask had fallen completely. After a brief break, the wife took the stand. She'd been dreading this moment. But when she sat down and looked out at the courtroom, she felt strangely calm. Evelyn walked her through the marriage systematically. Not sensationally, just the facts. The isolation from her mother. The financial restructuring that left her with nothing in her name. The documents she'd signed without understanding. The humiliations that built over time. Can you describe the moment you realized you were trapped? The wife spoke clearly. It was during an argument. He said if it ever went to court, I wouldn't survive 5 minutes. He smiled when he said it, like he was letting me in on a joke. That's when I understood. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. It was a trap closing. What did you do? I called my mother. For the first time in months. I didn't even know what to say. I just knew I needed help. And when you received the divorce papers, they weren't just divorce papers. There was a lawsuit accusing me of financial misconduct, of things I didn't even understand. I tried to get a lawyer. 3 different attorneys agreed to help me, then withdrew. I didn't understand why at first. Do you understand now? Yes. They were blocked. Deliberately. Systematically. So I'd show up to court alone, and everyone would assume I had no case worth defending. Evelyn paused. How did that make you feel? Like I didn't exist. Like everything I'd done, everything I contributed, none of it mattered. I was just an obstacle to be managed. The room was completely silent. Harrison's cross-examination was aggressive, but unfocused. He tried to paint her as bitter, as vindictive, as someone playing victim. But she answered every question calmly, with facts, with dates, with documentation. When it was over, she returned to her seat beside her mother. Her hands were shaking, but her voice had stayed steady throughout. The judge called for closing arguments. Harrison stood and delivered a practice speech about the dangers of letting vindictive spouses weaponize the court system, about how a difficult marriage didn't equal criminal conspiracy, about how his client had the right to protect his assets and his family's reputation. Then Evelyn stood. She didn't raise her voice, didn't perform. She simply laid out the pattern, document by document, witness by witness, audio recording to testimony to financial records. Your Honor, this case began as an attempt to destroy a woman who had committed no crime except marrying into a family that viewed her as expendable. The petitioner and his family didn't just seek divorce. They sought total annihilation. Financial, legal, social. They tried to ensure she couldn't fight back by blocking her access to representation. They used the court as a weapon. She paused, but in doing so, they exposed something much larger: a pattern of financial misconduct, corporate manipulation, systematic abuse of legal systems to maintain power and control. This isn't just about one marriage. It's about how certain families have operated with impunity for generations. The judge listened without interruption. The respondent isn't asking for revenge. She's asking for accountability, for the pattern to be documented, for the truth to matter, and for this court to send a clear message that justice isn't only available to people who can afford to buy it. She sat down. The judge took a long moment before speaking. I'll be issuing formal rulings within the week, but I want to state clearly for the record that what this court has witnessed is deeply troubling. The evidence of systematic legal obstruction alone would be sufficient to warrant serious consequences. The additional evidence of financial misconduct and corporate governance violations compounds those concerns significantly. He looked directly at the husband. Mr. Collins, you entered these proceedings believing the court would simply validate your narrative. Instead, you've exposed patterns of conduct that will likely result in criminal charges. Not just civil liability, criminal charges. The husband's face had gone pale. This court is referring multiple matters to federal prosecutors. We're also ordering full restitution proceedings and recommending bar investigations into several attorneys who appear to have participated in the obstruction scheme. The judge's voice was hard. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. As people filed out, the husband sat frozen at his table. His attorney was already on the phone. His hands were shaking. The wife stood and walked out with her mother. Behind them, she heard someone say his name, heard him not respond. Outside, reporters swarmed. Questions came rapid fire, but Evelyn handled them with practiced calm. The court will issue formal rulings soon. We're pleased that justice is being taken seriously. That's all we have to say today. They walked to the parking garage together, got in the car, sat in silence for a moment. Then the wife started crying, not from sadness, from release, from the weight of months lifting all at once. Her mother reached over and took her hand, said nothing, just held on. The legal outcomes came swiftly after that. Asset seizures, criminal referrals. Several executives from the husband's companies reached settlements. The husband himself faced multiple charges ranging from financial fraud to obstruction of justice. The divorce became a footnote, a minor detail in a much larger investigation. The media narrative shifted completely. She was no longer the wife with no lawyer. Headlines called her the primary witness in the Collins family corruption case. Her mother was no longer mysterious. She was identified as former federal prosecutor Evelyn Harmon, who returned to practice after 25 years to represent her daughter. The story had changed. 3 months later, the wife moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't luxury. The building was old, the floors creaked, the kitchen was cramped. But she'd chosen herself, signed the lease herself, paid the deposit from an account that was only in her name. It was the first place that had ever felt completely hers. Her mother helped her move in. They assembled furniture from boxes, argued about where the couch should go, made coffee in the tiny kitchen, and sat on folding chairs because the real ones hadn't arrived yet. It felt normal. Beautifully, impossibly normal. They began rebuilding their relationship slowly, cooking together, taking walks, having the kinds of conversations they'd missed during the years of distance. Sometimes they talked about the case. Sometimes they didn't. The wife started training in advocacy work, not law school. She didn't want to be an attorney, but she wanted to help other women navigate the systems that had nearly destroyed her. Financial literacy, legal rights, how to recognize coercive control before it became inescapable. She found purpose in the work, found herself again in the process of helping others find themselves. Her mother quietly returned to the kind of work she'd been doing for 25 years. Advisory roles, policy consultations. Her name appeared on reform proposals about legal access and domestic financial abuse protections. She didn't seek fame, didn't want it, but her work mattered, and that was enough. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the husband's attorney. It was a request for reduced damages. for consideration of his cooperation with investigations. For mercy, the wife held the envelope for a long moment. Thought about the man she'd married, the woman she'd been then. How much had changed. She filed it away without reading past the first paragraph. Some things didn't deserve her attention anymore. 6 months after the final courtroom hearing, she sat in a small community legal clinic. A volunteer position she'd taken one evening a week. A young woman came in, nervous and alone. She was trying to leave a controlling marriage. She had no money, no lawyer. She'd been told she had no options. The wife sat across from her and listened, really listened. Then she pulled out her phone. She typed a message to a contact from the advocacy network she'd been building. Someone who could help. Someone who understood. Then she looked at the young woman and said calmly, "You're not alone. And you have more options than you think." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know where to start." "Start by sitting here. By listening. By letting people help you who know what this feels like." She thought about her mother's words from months ago. About power not announcing itself. About waiting to be needed. She thought about sitting in that first courtroom. Empty chair beside her. Everyone certain she'd already lost. She thought about how wrong they'd all been. The young woman across from her took a shaky breath. What if they're too powerful? What if I can't win? The wife smiled slightly. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just with the kind of knowing that comes from surviving what seemed impossible. Powerful doesn't mean invincible. And winning looks different than you think. She paused. Sometimes winning just means refusing to disappear. They talked for over an hour. Made a plan. Connected resources. When the woman left, she looked different. Not fixed. Not saved. But less alone. The wife cleaned up the small office space. Turned off the lights. Walked to her car through the evening air. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. Just checking in. Asking if she wanted dinner tomorrow. She typed back a simple yes. Drove home to her small apartment with creaky floors and mismatched furniture. Made tea. Sat by the window watching the city lights. She thought about the photograph that used to hang in a house that was never really hers. The woman in white. The man everyone said she was lucky to have married. That version of herself felt impossibly distant now. She wasn't that woman anymore. Wasn't sure she ever really had been. She was something else entirely. Something harder to define, but easier to recognize. Someone who understood that justice wasn't given freely. That power wasn't just inherited. That surviving wasn't the same as living, but it was where living could begin. Her mother had taught her that. Not through words, but through presence. Through showing up when it mattered. Through fighting when fighting seemed impossible. The wife finished her tea. Washed the cup. Got ready for bed. Tomorrow she'd go back to her advocacy work. Back to helping women who felt trapped. Back to building something that mattered from the ruins of what had nearly destroyed her. It wasn't the life she'd imagined in that wedding photograph. It was better, because it was real, and it was hers, and no one could take that away. She turned off the light and thought about the young woman from tonight. Hoped she'd find her way. Hoped she'd learn what the wife had learned. That empty doesn't mean powerless. That alone doesn't mean defeated. And that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up creating exactly what they feared. Someone who refuses to stay silent. Someone who knows the difference between power and fear. Someone who understands that the most dangerous thing you can do to people who expect you to disappear is simply to exist. Loudly, publicly, persistently. The wife fell asleep in her small apartment. Safe, free, herself. And somewhere across the city, in a much larger house, the man who'd thought he could erase her sat with lawyers and pending charges and the slow realization that he'd lost something he'd never valued until it was gone. Not his wife. His certainty. His belief that the world was built for people like him and would always protect them. That certainty was gone now. Shattered. Irretrievable. And in its absence, something new had taken root. Consequence. The kind that lasted. The kind that mattered. The kind that changed things. The wife slept peacefully, dreamed of nothing in particular, woke to morning light and the sound of the city waking up around her. She made coffee, checked her messages, saw one from the advocacy network about another woman who needed help. She smiled, typed back her response. "I'm here." 2 words that meant everything. 2 words that proved she'd survived. 2 words that showed power wasn't about who could hurt you. It was about who you chose to help. And she made her choice. Every single day, she made it again. To exist. To help. To refuse to disappear. That was her victory. And it was more than enough. When someone tries to destroy you using every advantage they have, what does it say about their fear of who you really are? If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to stay silent.